thriller, The Stranger Behind You. This book dives deep into some very contemporary issues, including migration, the role of media today, and of course, the Me Too movement. Along with The Stranger Behind You, Carol is the author of 23 novels, including The Lake of Dead Languages, one of my favorites, The Seduction of Water, which won the 2003 Hammett Prize, The Widow's House, which won the 2018 Mary Higgins Clark Award, The Night Visitors, which won the 2020 Mary Higgins Clark Award. Her books have been translated into 16 languages, and she lives in the Hudson Valley with her family and teaches literature and writing at the New School and SUNY New Paltz. And let's take it away. And I actually have a question I'd like to start with, if I may, Carol. And it's sort of the big picture about you and your wonderful work as a writer, prolific writer. You're a writer. Your main character in this book is a writer. And you talk a lot about the writing. Well, you talk about the writing process, and you talk about Joan's desk, her stickly desk, and her window, and her Post-its, and where she writes and where she gets her inspiration. Can you speak a little bit to your writing process? I know you've been writing for many years. As a child, you were writing poetry, and it's certainly in your blood.
Yes. First of all, thank you so much, Sandra. Thanks for that lovely introduction. And thank you to the library in Greenwich for having me. I'm thrilled to be here. And thank you for reading my book. So writing process, as soon as you said sticky notes, I thought, I think there are some sticky notes over here. Fortunately, I don't have the whole wall filled with them with red yarn connecting them like the in certain kind of TV mysteries where the person, and in my book. So yes, I do tend to write about writers or teachers because these are the things that I know. I've been a writer and a teacher pretty much my whole adult life. And occasionally I'll try to venture into some other profession like stained glass restorer, but my heart is in writing, and I love writing about writing. And Joan she is a journalist. So that was a little bit of a leap for me because I've never written journalism. And so I had to do some research and talk to people about that. As for my writing process, I pretty much, I'm very much, as you said, I'm prolific. And that's not because I have the best work ethic in the world. It's because I'm kind of obsessed, actually, and I always have to be writing. So fortunately, it's an obsession that seems to be, doing me okay. I generally, when I'm working on a book, I get up in the morning and do other things. I do, I walk the dog who insists upon it. I, do some exercises, read the newspaper, but then pretty soon I'll settle down to the work of the day. And I do kind of think of it as just like going to work, coming to my desk, which I'm sitting at now. It's one of the nice things about Zoom is I kind of love talking to people from my desk. I write by hand. I write in these composition notebooks, and and honestly, I usually start out in the morning, not at my desk, but in bed writing. And when I finish whatever I've done for the week, then I will type up. And so it might be one chapter, it might be two chapters, depending on where I am in the novel and how fast I'm writing. But so there's sort of a back and forth between writing by hand and then writing that, typing that into the word processor, the laptop. I don't know, word processor, did we go back to we went back to the 90s all of a sudden. And then there's an editing process that goes forward. But that's kind of the bread and butter, I think, of as my writing process, the kind of day-to-day, which I'm very attached to. I mean, I change that up a little bit sometimes, but having that kind of routine, I think, for me, has always worked to get the main stuff done. I don't sit around and wait to be inspired, even though I'm always hoping that I will be in the work.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that.
Oh, sure.
And we're going to go around and sort of all ask different questions if we may.
Oh, great.
For sure. Does anyone else have a question next?
I do. Hi.
Hi,
Carol, thank you for being here today. It's
my
lovely.
pleasure.
This book seems quite personal to do from what I learned from the Behind the Book essay. How was this different for you to write than any of your other books that you have written over the years?
Oh, thank you, Claudia. That's a great question. And thank you for reading the Behind the Book essay. I'm always glad to know that they get read. And so, yes, in that there were a couple personal threads in this one, because it started with, being aware of the Me Too movement and then seeing the testimony of Blasey Ford during the Kavanaugh hearings. And I know that a lot of women watching that were very moved by it and affected and thought of things that had happened to them. I thought of something that had happened to my mother. And it brought all of that up. My mother had told me that she had been sexually assaulted when she was 18 in a hospital. And I found myself crying for her listening to Christine Blasey Ford. My mother was, at that point, had been gone for a year or two before that testimony. And when I thought about that, I guess I suddenly saw it in a new light. I knew about it and I knew that it had been this really traumatic thing that happened to my mother. But I just started thinking about how many other women, did things like this happen to, and were silenced, didn't feel like they could tell anyone. And so out of that, Drew, I knew I wanted to write something, that had to do with the Me Too movement, but I knew that I wanted it to connect not with the contemporary story, but also to reach back to women, years ago who, had these things happen to them. And because of the climate of when they lived, just never told anyone. So in it, having that sort of personal thread to it, it was both an inspiration and a way of sort of looking for direction in the book. It also, and it felt like a little bit of a mission as well. Like I was going to represent my mother. And doing that made me feel, and, in creating the character of Lillian, who's the old woman that Joan starts talking to in the, at the apartment building where she lives, I kind of felt like I was bringing my mother back to life a little bit for me. So that was really completely enjoyable, even though I was dealing with some difficult things. There were times where I would think, gee, I wish I had thought that I had asked my mother all the questions I had for her, and I realized no. And now that I'm thinking this through again, no, there were things I would have liked to have asked that I was, that I no longer could. So it was, there were emotional moments of it. And I think when you're writing something that is so personal, there's also a point where you have to be, you have to think about, well, how is this coming across to my reader? Are they getting, I have all these emotions about it. Have I gotten that on the page? Is it clear to them as well? So I'd say that's something I sort of extra have to think about during the editing process.
Well, I think it worked because I think Lillian was my favorite character. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And she's my favorite character too. Don't tell the others. But she's my favorite. Thank you, Claudia. Oh, that was a good question.
So I'm curious, as you pursued this book and you sort of settled on this, talking about this particular, the Me Too movement and that, how did you find the story of Lillian and the Magdalena house and that whole thing? Like, how do you when you bring the history into the books that you write? Is it, I have this idea and let me find something in historical that I can merge in? Does it start with the historical and then how are we bringing modern day in?
Mm-hmm. That's a really good question, because it and I'm immediately start thinking, do I remember exactly what order they happened in? Because sometimes I might not entirely remember. Like I'm trying to think, so the other thread, I had my mother's life story, and a lot of what happens to Lillian is based on my mother's life story. Even the fact that even some of the sort of outrageous things like the involvement with Murder Inc. My mother was not involved with Murder Inc., but she actually did know Abe Reles. And she lived a block from the Half Moon Hotel when she lived in Coney Island. So there are, and actually her brothers were arrested. So it's this whole history that was actually there. But then, of course, I made it into something else. She doesn't actually ever go to a Magdalen Refuge. So that came from a separate. And that's something I had always been interested in. But I think that in thinking about Joan's story and then Lillian's story, I came up with the idea. I was like, so what's this, where do they come together? And I had this idea. I saw a newspaper article about the work of Michelle Jones, who is a scholar whose name is misrepresented in my essay. I'll mention that in a minute. I'm very ashamed of that. But Michelle Jones had written, there was an essay about her. She's a historian who works on women's prisons. And she mentioned in this article, it was mentioned that there were Magdalen laundries in the United States. And I was fascinated by that because I knew that there were ones in Ireland. I did not know that there were ones in the United States. And then I did a little more digging and I found that there was one in Inwood. And that's a neighborhood I know because my husband has an apartment there and he grew up there. Both my daughters live in Inwood. It's an area I know. And I asked my husband, I said, did you know there was a Magdalen Laundry in where, what's now Inwood Park? And he said, no. And he said, it's not mentioned in any of the local histories. And that immediately kind of, activated my spidey sense. I was like, this seems like something that happened that's been hidden. And so then I started digging and doing the historical research. And I came up with the idea of, there being this old apartment building that had been a refuge. So that building is based on the actual Magdalen Refuge that was there, which is not there any longer. It's not an apartment building. You cannot live there. It burned down probably or I think it was closed and it was destroyed probably by the 50s or 60s. I don't think I ever found out exactly when, but I thought, wouldn't it be cool if that building existed and it was made into a fancy apartment building, sort of like the Dakota, or there are some buildings up in that area. I'm forgetting, Castle Village, I think, some, cool ones on the Hudson. And I thought, well, this is the location for all these people to come together. So it was kind of a combination of bits that inspired me, like my mother's history, and then looking for the history that would work with that. And I decided, and then doing the research and bringing it in. And sometimes the research just lent itself. I was like, there's a detail. There are these great stories in the New York Times archives of girls trying to escape and jumping out those windows, and sadly, several of them dying. But then also me inventing things like, I'll keep it there, and I'll create this other history. So that's what's kind of fun. So
I was curious about the two leading women characters, Joan and Melissa. And I started off relating to Joan and not to Melissa, but by the end of the book, I was rooting for Melissa. I just wondered if you could talk about the evolution and, kind of what you felt about Joan as well as what you felt about Melissa.
Good. And I'm so happy that you did come to root for Melissa, because I too, when I started, Joan was certainly my first character and my first narrator that I had in mind. And in fact, I think I wrote about 60, 70 pages of the book, all in Joan's point of view. And then I ran into a problem. So Joan, as we know, since you've read the book, is suffering. She's been attacked and she becomes sort of an agoraphobe and can't leave her apartment. And the only person she talks to is Lillian. So 60, 70 pages in, I was like, wow, this book is going to be really boring because she can't go out. It's kind of like, and this was before the pandemic and lockdown. I was like, oh no, I liked the idea of her being limited to the apartment, but I also felt like this is limiting, this is it's just going to be Joan and Lillian sitting here talking, which is fun, but maybe not so much for the reader. And at that point, I knew that Melissa was this other character, the wife of Caspar Osgood, the predator. And I thought, what I have to do is I have to bring, Melissa's point of view in here. And I had written one book before that had that shifting point of view, which was The Night Visitors. And I liked it. I had fun with it. And I thought, okay, I'll do that. I'll have, so I went back to the beginning and I started writing from Melissa's point of view. And frankly, it was difficult at first because Melissa wasn't the person I'm most identified with. And here she's somebody who's married to a man who turns out to be a predator. The question always is, what did she know? How much did she know? What should she have known? But I thought that was so interesting to really explore what would happen to a woman like Melissa when it's revealed that her husband was a predator. And as I wrote her, I just started liking her more and more. And what I especially liked about her, both because it was helpful to me as a writer and because I admired it, is that she's someone who gets things done. She's competent. She goes out in the world and she does things. Whereas Joan's sitting, writing at home. And so she was a really fun character to write. And I did. I started really liking her and feeling as invested in her as I felt invested in Joan. Still like Lillian maybe the best of all, but Joan and Melissa. And then I don't know at what point even if I thought this while I was writing the book, I thought, oh, I've got these three characters who represent three different ages of women. I've got, somebody who's like 20, Joan's like 29, maybe 30, early 30s. Melissa's in her late 40s. I think at first she was older, and then I had to sort of move her around a little bit to get the chronology right. And then I have this, the 90-year-old Lillian. And if you think about it, then I even have the younger character Lillian as a young woman. So I felt like, oh, I've got this scope, which I don't think I planned, but that's how it worked out. And I was happy when I saw that. So thank you. I'm glad you liked Melissa as time went on.
I hate to, I'm sorry, was somebody else going to talk? I hate to admit this, Carol, but I didn't really like Melissa at first. I was kind of annoyed with Joan. Later on, I liked Melissa towards the end when I felt that she was really helping everybody out. Mm-hmm. But when I first read about her and she was a little bit too, talking about her, her Gucci this or this, she seemed so kind of trite. I don't know. She didn't seem like there was a lot of substance to her. I did also kind of question her, but the group has already told me that this is common. I questioned her lack of insight into her husband and her finances, and everybody in the group said to me, "Oh, no, that happens, women." So, but then at the end, but you're right. And I kind of was, felt like, what kind of person is this? She's spying on this writer and, sneaking up to her apartment and stealing things. And it's like, what is going on with her? But then at the end, when she kind of came around and helped both AJ and Melissa, and Joan and everybody, and like you said, got things done, then I felt good about her. But initially, her character kind of bothered me.
Oh, I think she should bother you initially. So I'm absolutely agree. And she is somebody who I think is, not her best self at the beginning. And I think that happens to people. That they, especially I think, the way I thought about her was as somebody who probably had suspicions about her husband, but could not allow those to come to the forefront of her mind because her whole life was dependent on, first of all, she did love him, and her life was dependent on this particular, being invested and believing whatever he said, and not looking too closely into the finances. And I think there's a culpability there. I don't think she knew what was happening, but I think she allowed herself not to know. And so I did want, and I do believe that when people are suppressing some kind of truth, even if they're suppressing it from themselves, it's damaging. So I think she's living a life where she is trite, she's like
in denial.
She's in denial, and she's not, she's entertaining herself with, pretty superficial stuff, like, the next, Gucci handbag or whatever. But that's the world she lives in. I do know that world. I live now in the Hudson Valley, but I lived in a very prosperous community in Long Island for many years. And, I knew the, women who had the next Gucci handbag, and, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I also knew the sort of how that could become sort of obsessive, that you get the next thing, and how you can be focused on that, maybe because you're not really looking at other things in your life.
Well, the other question I had is, how come Joan didn't have any friends, like where she grew up or even at work? I mean, she liked Sylvia.
Yeah.
But she didn't seem to have any friends her own age.
She didn't. And I think she says at one point, she does explain that, but you're right, she doesn't. And it's not something, I'm someone who, always has a lot of, thank goodness I'm lucky to have, good friends. She said what she says, and the way she explains it, and maybe it's a bit of a justification, is that, she, in her late 20s, she became obsessive about working on this newspaper story, and that friends began to be exasperated with her because she wouldn't go out and she wouldn't do
things. That's true. Yeah.
Also, she's somebody in her late 20s who most of her friends, I think, I'm trying to remember now, is she like 30, or she might be 29. She's somebody who, she lives in the city, and a lot of her friends are getting married and leaving. And that's something I have observed from having, my daughter's 29 now. It doesn't happen with everybody, but she mentions, this friend moved to the suburbs or had a child, and we didn't have as much in common. Of course, those are all justifications. And I think, there might be something else, in Joan's psyche, what's been keeping her from, really, why has she kind of isolated herself? Why has she, been obsessive about this story and creating the story? But I do think it happens sometimes that people cut themselves off from friendships, either because of, ambition and obsession with finishing something. I, as a writer, there have been times when I've become so obsessed with writing that I'll finish a book and I'll look around and go like, oh, I haven't seen my friends in a really long time. And, either my friends have been tolerant of the fact that I haven't seen them, or they've, stopped calling. And, that happened to me once in maybe about 15 years ago. And I thought, I gotta not do that. It's like the writing is, yes, I've become very focused on it. But life matters too, and people matter. And it's, it's important to put the notebook down and go out for lunch with friends and do that. But it's, I think it happens to people sometimes that they don't remember that, and they go through periods of their lives where they don't have as many friends. I'm hoping Joan's got more friends as she moves forward. I think she will. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks.
I'm worried about Joan. I mean, she's got cute.
I think too, we have to remember that Joan was going through a trauma of her own, even before she started pursuing the article, because it happened to her, right? And so when something like that happens, you aren't confiding in your friends. You're embarrassed because you can't believe that you let it happen in this day and age.
Yeah.
That is going to put a divide with your friends. Now she's pursuing this story. Like she's, all of these things come together, and, her friends aren't necessarily going to be hanging around waiting for her to have her catharsis so that they can go get a drink. Right.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I do think it's an interesting, because when you think of how I worked for a while on a for 3 years, I worked on a hotline, emergency hotline, and I talked to a lot of, lonely people around the country. And there's a lot of loneliness and isolation in our society. And people find themselves or create a situation or just find themselves in places where they are isolated. And it's something, it's something to be aware of, that it could be happening to other people, we know. And, that people cut themselves off or, allow themselves to be cut off from other people. And, be aware for ourselves as well that, put down the book, go out. I mean, I have that sort of battle like I had it this morning. I got notes from my agent last night on a work in progress. I immediately started working on it. And then a friend asked if I wanted to take a walk this morning. And part of my brain said, no, I want to stay here and finish what I'm doing. And the other part of my brain said, get up and go out and take a walk with your friend. And otherwise they won't keep one. It'll probably help your, mental state. And also, you're not going to have this friend if you always say no. I'm always really grateful for the friends who are tolerant and will understand when I say, oh, I'm on a deadline. I'm sorry, I can't.
I'm muted.
But, you can't do that to them all the time, So I went out for a nice walk. And that was, yes. Well, before the rain hit. Now we've got rain here.
Carol?
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, one of the themes of your story is sexual harassment.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering, in doing research and in writing your story, what was your working definition of sexual harassment?
That is a really good question, because I think that definition has shifted. And I'm embarrassed to say, I don't think I have like a textbook definition available to you. Or one that I realized as I was writing. But I would say any, time that somebody is made to is harassed into a situation or made to feel uncomfortable, in a power dynamic, in a workplace or in a school environment. So it's not, it doesn't have to be sexual assault, doesn't have to involve, a physical encounter. I think, unfortunately, we have so many examples of it. As I wrote this book, I kept thinking, gee, maybe the Me Too movement won't be so important when by the time it's published. And it's like, nope, there's another case. There's like, and even to this week today. So I think one of the cases that I thought was so interesting in the news recently was the aide, I think it was an aide, or it was a journalist actually, who in talking about her interaction with Cuomo, that she said she was made to feel, he said inappropriate sexual things to her, and she was made to feel, because of the power dynamic, she couldn't do anything about it. And that she felt that it was a power. If this was not a question, this wasn't sex, it wasn't attraction, this was being reminded that she had no power in the situation. So again, I'm sorry not to have a definition of sexual harassment for you.
Well, that's very good. That's very good. The power aspect. I like that.
Well, I think that's so important, and that's something to always remember. Like I, as a teacher, always try to remember this, that I'm an adjunct. I don't consider myself someone powerful in the classroom. And yet there is an unequal power dynamic between me and my students. Mm-hmm. So if I said something embarrassingly sexual, in a sexual context to a student, that would be harassment, because they're not in a position to do anything about it. They're not, yes, they are. They could go complain about it, and students will. But I have put them like it would not be appropriate. It took me a while to realize, I still do occasionally, a student will come in and I'll be like, oh, I love that shirt. Yeah. But you're not even really supposed to do that. But I try to be careful just not to say things that would embarrass my students, or make them feel uncomfortable, because it's then we have an unequal power dynamic, and I'm putting them in a position to feel uncomfortable, where they, may not feel that they can do anything about it. So I'd go that far.
Thank you.
Yeah. And just to follow up, with my mother, what had happened to her was that she was in a hospital getting her tonsils out when she was 18, and a doctor brought her into in the middle of the night, a nurse took her out of her bed, brought her into an exam room, and a doctor told her to take her clothes off. She said she started shaking so much, he then sent her back. So he never touched her. And I think my mother, because of that, felt like she hadn't been sexually assaulted, but of course she had, in a incredibly traumatic, frightening way. So there, I think, it's important to understand those instances, because, she never, she just felt ashamed about it. She didn't, go tell anyone. So, I think it is important that we've broadened our ideas of what sexual assault and harassment are.
Thank you.
You're welcome. That was very heavy, so I think we were taking it off.
That's very heavy.
It was, sorry.
It's an important part of your book.
Yeah.
I do have another question that is perhaps a little bit lighter.
All right.
You did speak a little bit about the building, and you spoke about Inwood, and New York City, Hudson River Valley are really characters in so much of the material you create. They're their own beings. They're their own atmosphere. Buildings are. I mean, certainly we can see Mohonk Mountain House. We've seen that.
Oh, yeah.
We love that place. And I know you've had stories in Italy and whatnot. But can you speak to maybe another location that you think you might like to write about, or where you would like to send some of your characters?
Someplace fun that I can go as well. Thank you. And so, yeah, the Hudson Valley, has been, even before I moved up here, it was my imaginative home, and it's been a great place. And I continue. When I moved up here, I was like, oh, I guess, am I done with writing about the Hudson Valley now that I'm here? Haven't I done it enough? And then I'll see something and go like, oh, here's another. Just this morning, I ended up in Kingston at the Brickyards, which I had never been to before. And as my friend and I explored, we were like, this would make a good setting for a book. So not done with the Hudson Valley, but I did just finish a book which is set in Coney Island. So a little bit, although I consider that, I was like, can I stretch? The Hudson sort of goes down into the bay. It's sort of still my Hudson Valley. But I did have a lot of fun writing. I actually took I've written a book that's totally historical and set in Coney Island. And it's a character like Lillian. When I finished Lillian, I wasn't done with her. And I was like, oh, I want to write really this character. It can't be Lillian because we know how her story ended, but I wanted to write that story set actually in 1941. So I did that, and using Coney Island, I now have in my kitchen, I've got these huge maps of Coney Island on the refrigerator, and I really delved into that particular setting, which was I touched upon in Stranger Behind You, but I went into it more. I'm always on the lookout for settings, really important to me. I wish Mohonk would not be quite so expensive so I could go back there and write another. I've tried to convince them many times that I should be their writer in residence, and they have just not taken me up on it. But it's harder, I think. I think of writing, I did write 2 books set in Italy, and I've traveled recently a number of times in Greece because of my husband's poetry and his interest in Greece. And I've thought of using that as a setting, but I think it's a little harder now to set something in a completely different culture. I feel like the client, it would have to be from the tourist perspective. And I think I feel differently about that than I felt about it even, I guess, 15 years ago when I wrote the Italian books. There's something about, not that you couldn't do it, and not that people don't do a great job doing that, but I feel like I'd have to approach it a little differently if I did that now. The American in a foreign place? How much would I have to understand? What would be sort of the responsibility to representing that place? So I do feel like, and yet I might do it sometime. It would probably be a very, if I did, like taking, like when I wrote the Italian books too, I took like a small community, like an American Academy, or, and tried to sort of, not say like, oh, here I can sort of represent all of Italy. It makes me feel a little nostalgic I love the work of Mary Stewart and her romantic suspense novels, in which she would send a character to a Greek island and there'd be a mystery. And I love those books. Part of me would just love to have a career like, oh, this year I'm going to go to Barcelona. I'm going to set my next book there. And who knows, maybe
You and me both.
Yeah. Pardon?
You and me both. I'd love to do that as well.
I know there's something extremely tempting about that. And I have to admit, those Italian books were very connected to some trips we took. So who knows? We'll see. But Coney Island was my venturing a little further abroad. So.
Perfect. Thank you. Do we have more questions for Carol?
Yes, I'd like to ask a question, please. Good afternoon, Carol.
Good afternoon, Malcolm, right?
Malcolm, yeah.
Correct.
Absolutely. Were you at any time inclined, given the religious background of the Refuge and Sister Dolores, etc., to include anything of a religious teaching, given that we're so in the dark when it comes to this kind of the kind of relationships that the three principal characters had in the book? Were you inclined at any time to push a slightly more religious or even just Catholic agenda?
Oh, well, certainly not an agenda, but you bring up a very interesting point. It also, I think I feel the same responsibility when I write about a place as when I write about a religion. I was not brought up as a Catholic, but my mother was. So I always feel like I sort of have her training. I actually was baptized, but not then brought up religiously. So I'm not really in a position to, give, really an exploration of the Catholic Church. I am interested in the history of the Catholic Church, and I was interested in, for instance, I did spend some time going to the Good Shepherd Church that is in Inwood. I try to, if I am going to talk about, another religion like Catholicism, I try to make sure that I'm being even-handed. I'm afraid that often comes out in the fact that I'll have a really good nun, and then maybe I'm not that happy about other aspects of the church, but I'm not critiquing the church or even offering any, expert, criticism of it, or as you said, a teaching. I'm not in a position to do that. So I'm simply coming as an outsider, trying to represent it as I know, what I know about it. And I always am finding more interesting things. When a friend of mine read this book, Stranger Behind You, and she said, I worked with the nuns of the Good Shepherd when I started my social work. This is what she said. She did training as a social worker in probably, I guess, like the 90s. And she told me about the nuns of the Good Shepherd Church who were real activists. And I was like, oh, I did not know that. And then it's like, oh, that would be an interesting aspect to talk about. But again, I would do it very much as an outsider. It's not something, I have a spiritual sense, but I don't really have a trained religious sense. So I would try not to, misrepresent anything. But, you're right that religion is it is an element in this book. And it's even a bigger element in the Coney Island book I just wrote.
Well, I wish you all the best with that.
Oh, thank
you very much.
Good. Oh, I hope it's a little hard. I did go and write something that was a little different, and that's always hard. We're trying to see now if my my agent's reading it, and we're going to show it to my editor soon. And my first reactions have been like, "Oh, this is not the same thing you usually do." Right. And I'm like, "Yes, I know. I was a little, I have to do something different once in a while."
Good.
Thank
Good.
you.
Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you for your question. Yeah, we'll pause and think about that.
Are there more questions?
Yes. One aspect that I found interesting was so towards the end when it comes out that some say she had hallucinations, some say, oh, it was probably a ghost that you talked to, but then it's also her memories from my grandmother, which I guess she grew up with, has in the background. Can you explain a little bit more there how, I mean, I guess it shows that different people have different almost beliefs or feelings towards that. Can you say a little bit more about that? Because I found that very fascinating.
Well, I wanted to sort of give a space for how different people would want to interpret it. I love a ghost story. I am just addicted to ghost stories. I love watching them. I love reading them. And yet I also, I'm not writing a full-blown ghost story. And I know that there are readers for whom that is a kind of a deal breaker, that they don't want to go there. I also thought appropriately for this story, we didn't need to know. There could be this little bit of a mystery. And that's always hard to figure out exactly where you can, do you have to answer the reader every question? And I have an editor who's very thorough, and she would probably say yes. But she, but even with her, she'll ask the question and I'll answer most of them. But that I wanted to give a little bit of, have a sense that, okay, this we don't know. Joan has been hit on the head and she could be having hallucinations. That's an absolutely, plausible explanation for what happens. She could be filling in with the information, both from what she had heard from her grandmother that had filtered down through her mother, and also, just looking on the internet, what, where it came from exactly, that could be the explanation. Or Lillian could have been a ghost who visited her. That's actually my favorite explanation. Full disclosure, I think Lillian's a ghost that came and and visited with her. And my feeling about Lillian is that, she's someone, I thought the idea of a ghost as somebody stuck because of what happened to them. And I thought that was an interesting metaphor for someone who had suffered a sexual assault, that she is frozen in that time and she can't move on. Now, if you then ask me, why does she appear as a 90-something-year-old woman? I just because I thought I liked that. And I thought, well, she could age as a ghost. We don't know what the rules of ghosting are. So for me, I'm happy to think of her as a ghost, but I wanted to give, not only did I want to give, an out for people who were like, no, she's not a ghost. This is a psychological phenomenon. I'm okay with that because the ghosts that I like are the ones that work psychologically and metaphorically. That a haunting could be seen as a psychological haunting, and it could be, I feel like, can it be both? Maybe it could be both. And certainly if I'm going to write about it, I want it to be both. It's the turn of the screw, or, is the governess crazy? Are there ghosts? Or, why not both? That's where I land on the turn of the screw. Also one of my favorite books. So I did feel like, and it's interesting, I asked people who read it, so some of my first readers, who I knew weren't big fans of the supernatural. I was like, I have one friend who's very rational. She's an 18th century scholar. And I was like, yeah, but I know you wouldn't want like vampires or fairies, but what about ghosts? And she was like, oh yeah, I'm okay with ghosts. So I was like, okay, you're my target audience. I'm going to go for, because I think ghosts, it could be a metaphor. We're all haunted.
I was just going to say that it's often ghosts have to do with secrets and things coming out into the light. And I feel that there is a lot of that happening for a variety of the characters. So that kind of worked for me. So thank you.
Okay, good. I'm glad. Thank you. I'm glad it worked. And that's what I was really, I feel like, and I tell my students this because they'll bring in kind of fantasy stories or supernatural stories. I'll be like, I am okay with all of that. You can bring in your supernatural story. It still has to make sense psychologically, and the characters have to make sense. Characters have to be believable. I don't care if they're gnomes, and I literally said this last week. Your gnomes have to have make sense psychologically.
I just wanted to mention, I was disappointed that Lillian wasn't real, because I love the fact that you brought a voice to an older woman, because older women don't exist. And here this woman, and I happen to be blessed to know women in their 90s who are sharp, and to have them have a voice is wonderful. And just the intergenerational relationship that developed there.
You're completely right, and I'm sorry if it's disappointing that she's not real.
No, she was my favorite.
She's real to me, she's just as real to me as if she, had been there in the flesh, whether she's a ghost or an hallucination. Her character is 100% real because she's based on my mother, so she's 100% real to me. And I think you're 100% right. I think it is, older women are really not represented in fiction and become invisible. And it's difficult, actually, in commercial fiction. I have been told not to write, I've had characters, where I've given in the manuscript or the proposal, and they're like, this character's too old, you can't have her be. I see, Claudia, your eyes widen. I know it's a sad thing. I'm really, and I hope it changes. I do think it could be changing a little bit. And and it's difficult for a writer of my age. I'm 62, and that is no longer an age that your main protagonist can be. So I am sort of fooling around with the two-person narration, which I like anyways, but that I can have an older woman and a younger woman. And I would love to push it further than that, but I also need to get a contract. And there is, perhaps not in literary fiction, but if you're publishing as a commercial mystery writer, there is pressure. Now, again, I think people who feel more secure in their, that they can push that do. And there are people who have been pushing that, and I admire them, but you have to, it's not easy, and it angers me, right? Frankly, it's like, I want to tell a story of women my age and women older than me. And it's annoying not to be able to, worse than annoying. So that is the issue.
Wouldn't that depend somewhat on the setting of the novel? For instance, if you were doing it in the Adirondacks or the hills of West Virginia, pick your location, then you can have an older woman that fits in it for like the hills of Oklahoma or up in the Adirondacks.
You could have an older character, certainly, and certainly, no reason why you couldn't have an older character. And again, it's not like the rules have been written down in stone, but you would still have a difficulty, I think, having like your main character be an older person. You could still, people do it, I think, and do it really well. I just, and I will probably need to be braver as I get older, and I need to, and I do, because I do want to write about those characters. And it's not that those characters aren't in every setting, and should be in every setting. It's, and this is something I think is not, representation is talked about a lot now, which I think is a good thing. But representation of older characters, I don't know that it is talked about so much, but we'll see. So if you see older characters, but that is one reason why I was really happy to have Lillian. And, we'll continue trying to have older characters. I have a friend who's a romance writer, and what she'll say, yeah, you can have a character who is faux old, which means like, oh, they're in their 40s. Now, which becomes more and more ridiculous.
Are there more questions for wonderful Carol?
From wonderful group.
I might have one last one before we go, if I may. And I'm going to point to Nicole. Forgive me. This I'm not blaming her, but I'm stealing from her. We spoke a lot about this book, The Stranger Behind You, and we know that you've got this wonderful family of books. You've got so many. Is there a favorite baby, or is there one that you would like to make into a television show or a movie that you think lends itself most to that?
Oh, that's such a lovely question. I used to say, oh, I don't have favorites. That would be wrong. But the truth is I do like some of them. I love them all, but some of them I love more than others. And anyone that became a television show, that would be my favorite. I can assure you. I've often thought, while I'm writing, I do picture sort of, what it would be like as a movie or a limited series. So I am totally down with any of them becoming that. I thought this Stranger Behind You, which I was, I was very fond of writing, and I'm still very fond of it. The Widow's House is one that I still have like this particular really strong feeling. And I hear my agent's voice in my head right now saying, say the next book, that's your favorite. To get you all to go out and buy it. There are favorites, I guess.
And that's okay. Absolutely.
To answer that. And, if anyone, from your lips to some movie producers' ears, if you know anybody, hand them the book. I'm always, we have in my town, the actor Jeffrey Dean Morgan lives in Rhinebeck, and occasionally I see him and I'm always like ready to like slip my book out. Like, here. Don't you think this would be? I actually thought the Night Visitors, which is set in sort of a Woodstock-like location, I've always thought would make a really a good movie. So
terrific.
None of that has ever happened to me. So
Will. The best is yet to come.
Well, from your lips to Hollywood's ears. Thank you.
Thank you again so very much, Carol. And as a reminder to everyone, The Stranger Behind You was our wonderful talking point this month, and we are better for it and glad for it. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for reading it. It's such a pleasure. And thank you for your wonderful questions. And